Good morning and welcome to the Blackletter Brunch. I'm Raul Martinez and my presenter today is publisher, designer, and design historian Paul Shaw. Paul has researched and written about the history of graphic design with a focus on typography, lettering, and calligraphy for 3 decades. His areas of interest have included W.A. Dwiggins, Morris Fuller Benton, Blackletter, Helvetica, and the signage of the New York City subway system, George Salter, Phil Grushkin, Frank Holm, Renaissance scribe Bartolomeo Sanvito, and sculptor Andrea Bregno. Paul Shaw's presentation today is about calligraphic and hand-lettered book jackets by George Salter, Philip Grushkin, and Michael Harvey, 3 of the 20th century's leading designers in this field. How did you become interested in these designers, Paul?
Well, I've been interested in George Salter since I was in high school, which was a long time ago. I would have gone to Cooper Union if Salter hadn't unfortunately died 5 years before I was planning to go to college. Um, and I organized the George Salter papers at the Newberry Library back in 1979, I think it was, a long time ago. And ended up with a lot of the duplicates. They, for some reason, did not want duplicate jackets. And so I've got a small collection of pristine Salter jackets, which are the ones I used for this talk. Phil Grushkin, I knew Phil from the early 80s because I interviewed him about George Salter. And then when a book dealer was trying to sell what turned out to be part of Phil Grushkin's archive, about a decade ago, I was asked to write the essay for the catalog. That collection went to Columbia University. And it turned out when I was researching that I talked to Paul Grushkin, Phil's son, out in California, out in the Bay Area, in Pinhole, whatever it's called. And he had a lot of stuff, and I wasn't allowed to talk about it in the catalog because the book dealer didn't want to undercut the sale. But Paul died about a year or so after I met him, and the letter from archive bought what he still had. So now the Grushkin archives are split between San Francisco and New York, which is unfortunate. Michael Harvey, I met Michael in the early 80s. I brought him to New York to give a talk. It was heavily attended by, I think, 12 people. Of which like 6 of them were stars in the design world, not members of the Society of Scribes. So actually a modest success. And Michael and I were friends up until he died in 2013. I've written several things online and in magazines about Michael. And when I was working on something about 10 years ago about Michael, his daughter at the University of Reading gave me a cache of images, about 600, I think, of his jackets, which I have still never fully organized. So this material comes from those 3 sources. Nothing from the letter from archive. That plenty of other material. This could have been a much longer talk than it already is. So that's how I got involved in all 3 men, Raul.
Wow, so you've known about them for quite a while.
Yeah, unfortunately, the only one I never met in person was George Salter, though I interviewed his widow for oral history at Columbia, Agnes Salter, along with his adopted daughter, and their Salter materials at Smith College. So the Salter materials also divided up at several institutions. Um, Michael's work, as far as I know, most of it's at University of Reading where he taught. Um, I don't know what happened to all the books that lined his living room with his jackets after he died and his wife passed away. I don't know what's happened to those books because it was like looking at the entire history of his career just sitting in his living room in Dorset. Anything else you want to ask, Raul, before we get started?
No, why don't we just get started with your presentation?
All right, well, the first thing I want to do is, let's see, I want to share this document, this email. If everybody can see it, it says background material for book jacket talk. And this is just a list I quickly made the other day of sources for those interested in these three men and their work. So if you want to take a screenshot of it, or I can eventually email it to Raul if he wants to share it with participants. But it lists two books about Salter's jackets. Tom Hansen did one in 2004. And a year before, a book dealer in Germany did one all about Salter's German book jackets. And then there's several websites that have material on him. Smith College, talking about some of the stuff which they own. Wellesley, which is stuff put up by Thomas Hansen as he was preparing his book 20 years ago. The Leo Beck, what's it called? Leo Beck Institute in New York apparently has a collection of Salter stuff, which I didn't realize till several years ago. And then Jill Gage of the Newberry Library apparently did a talk on YouTube about Salter a couple of years ago during the pandemic. For Phil Grushkin, there's my website, which lists the catalog I did. I have copies for sale. Phil Grushkin Designer's Archive. And then after Phil died in the late 90s, his widow and the Grolier Club, where he was a member, did a small book about his life, which you might be able to find online. I don't have a copy. And Letter from Archive has a note about getting the Paul Grushkin part of the Phil Grushkin archives. And I don't know how much stuff they've put up online. For Michael, there's a lot of books which he authored over his career. The first one in 1975, lettering design, followed a decade later by creative lettering, drawing, and design, then carving letters in stone and wood, 1987, then calligraphy in the graphic arts, stealing a title from me in 1988, creative lettering today, which is actually a combination of earlier titles in 1996. Then just before he died, he wrote an autobiography which he was selling personally, so I'm not sure where you can get copies today, called Adventures with Letters. And then, as I said, you can see some articles I've done on my website about Michael, one about his opinions and one about his notebooks that he had for teaching that he gave me scans of before he passed away. So those are some things that you can learn a little more about these three men.
Why don't you email that to me after the lecture, Paul, and I'll include that in the recap.
Okay, yeah, I can send that to you. Stop the share, we'll reshare. So Michael, these men were not just jacket designers. I'm not getting, oh, there we are. Are we getting full share now, Raul?
Yeah, I can see the.
So Salter was a overall graphic designer who did the logo for Lincoln Center, which I don't think has been used anymore, the original one. He was a book designer, but it's his jackets that he's best known for, as well as his teaching at Cooper Union with a couple of generations of calligraphers and designers, including Milton Glaser, Herb Lou Ballin, Grushkin, Jeannie Wong, and a number of others. Grushkin was a jacket designer early in his career, and then he became a art director at Harry Abrams, the art book publisher in New York. And then from that, he became an independent book designer. So the work I'm going to show of him is limited in time span compared to Salter. Salter's book jacket work goes from 1922 till his death in 1967, though I'm not showing anything as early as 1922. Grushkin's goes roughly from somewhere around 1944 till basically 1960, though there's a couple jackets that I've seen from the early 70s. Michael was trained as a stone cutter. He worked with Reynolds Stone, who was not a direct disciple of Eric Gill, but in the Gill tradition, and Michael is a continuation of the Gill tradition. But he also began to do book jackets in the 50s and other graphic design. And later on in the 80s and 90s, he did a lot of typefaces. He actually did one typeface in the 60s that was metal called Zephyr for the Ludlow Company. But his main type design career began in the 80s with Monotype and then with Adobe. So his book jackets that I seem to have started on 1955. And the last one I could find dated so far is 1990, but I suspect Michael was still doing jackets into the early 2000s, though it was not his major activity. What you're seeing on this title screen are two typefaces that Michael did. It's the first one called O'Brath. It was this outline one. He named a lot of his typefaces after jazz musicians he liked. And the sans serif one below is called Mentor Sans, which I believe he did with Andy Benedict and Fine Fonts after he quit doing types with Adobe. I don't have typefaces designed by Salter or by Grushkin. Salter did one called Flex. It's not particularly terrific. He did it to get money to help emigrate from Germany to the United States. And Grushkin never did a typeface. So I'm just using some typefaces that sort of suggest them. This is Jovica Veljevich, is a Veljevich script typeface for Salter's name. And here it's Georg Salter, because Georg Salter was born in Germany in 1897. And he was a stage designer, and in the early 20s, he also began doing book jackets. But in 34, he emigrated to the United States. And so the first couple jackets are going to show you the range that he did between 29, which is 7 years into his German career, until he moved to New York in 1934. And I've tried to choose jackets that show a range. He did jackets that look like type, like this jacket where he's imitating type, but on a single line is actually type. Mix of neoclassical, fraktur, sans serif, stencil, cursive, and slab serif letters. And you can see his signature down there. Salter always believed in signing his jackets, and Grushkin followed that teaching. With Michael, we'll see it's not quite so strict. Interesting use of the hyphen as part of the A in Stalin. And I think Der Rote Dictator and what's at the bottom, I believe, is type, but Stalin has been hand lettered. Now, a lot of the jackets I'm showing you, you're going to be seeing both the spine and the front. So you have to imagine a line, coming down there that divides it. Because if they come from jackets that haven't been put onto books, if they're proofs given to the designer, then they're pristine, but they haven't been cut down. Sometimes they'll have a back also. In a few examples, I only show the front, but usually if they're all together, I'm showing you the spine and the front, especially because often all three men would change the way they did things on the spine. And this one looks like it doesn't even have the name of the publisher on the spine. But this is Salter doing a sort of black letter. It's his own interpretation, so we can't quite call it a fraktur or a betard. Maybe it's the closest to a betard or a Schwabacher. And what you're seeing with this one is something that's going to be typical of Salter's work, especially in the United States, which are these little sort of sketchy illustrations that he would do. And here's his sort of interpretation of a pointed pen cursive. And one thing you'll see with Salter, especially in what I'm focused on, are very idiosyncratic letter forms, which Phil Grushkin picks up from him, as do other students of his at Cooper Union. This is probably Salter's most famous German jacket for Alfred Doblun's Berlin Alexanderplatz, which was a German, I think, made-for-TV movie about 20 years ago. It's all about Weimar, Germany, and it's considered to be a landmark in German book jacket design because he put all this text onto the front cover, essentially summarizing this sprawling novel. And here you can start seeing some of his small little sketches interspersed. This is an early example of, sort of expressive calligraphy that Salter gets to be known for, especially in the United States. Here it's been drawn to suggesting a brush. It's actually a quotation. If you look carefully, you can see the grimettes, the French-style quotation marks. And it's from a journalist. So it's from writing. The journalist's name is Kish, and it's journalistic writings. So the rest of these by Salter, and I've changed his name here to his anglicized name to George, go from the time he came to New York in 34 until he died in 67. And I've tried to organize these stylistically. So if you want to see the dates, they're down here in the credits. So we'll get some sense of him changing his style over the years, but I decided not to do a chronological talk because I figured the group people listening to this today are more interested often in the letter forms and the calligraphy. So this is one of several that he did in this sort of cubist collage style in the 30s. There was one Manhattan Transfer, which the letter from Archive has the jacket for that. But here he's doing stencils influenced by Paul Renner's Futura, but it's not a direct copy. So some forms are taken from that typeface, like this Y. The Invaders, and you'll see that there's a lot of jackets that Salter does at the end of the 30s and into the 40s. They have to do with contemporary German history or novels about what was happening in Germany in the Nazi years. And Salter had left for New York in order to avoid the Nazi crackdown on Jews, even though that was quite early in the crackdown, 1934. His father had converted to Protestantism from Judaism because his father was a manager for Gustav Mahler's orchestra and had to be Protestant and not Jewish. So technically, Salter was raised as a Protestant, but of course he was genetically Jewish, so he was at risk when the Nazis came to power, and he was smart enough to get out. The Invaders, obviously, is what you don't see is the Nazis. But here is Salter doing stencil letter forms. And this is a much later one. You can see 1951. It actually looks much more like one of his designs from the 60s. I'm really surprised to find out how early this one is. And we can see his own interpretation of stencil letter forms. I mean, it's, they're not there. You can see hints of type in his letter forms, but he's not copying specific typefaces. All aboard for Ararat is H.G. Wells' book, much to my surprise. Alliance was some publisher that did a lot of books in the early 40s having to do with political events. Well, this is a novel as far as I know. But here you can see Salter doing a neoclassical or Bedoni style letter form. It's lettering, it's not type. There's only a few jackets I've ever seen that Salter did type, and I've tried to stay away from type in this entire talk, even though there's more jackets by Grushkin in type, and there's a few by Michael Harvey. This is one of the early, I think, terrific jackets of Salter, and I put this one together with the last one because of this sense of space and his use of airbrush. Salter was known for using the airbrush in his early New York years. Got away from that by the 1950s, but in the 30s and 40s, a lot of his jackets use airbrush for effects like the clouds here. And we'll see some of that with Phil Grushkin's work. This is once again a Bedoni-esque style, bit of lettering. Crazy Horse, which is one of my favorites, done in 1942, has a style of lettering that you find with a lot of book jacket designers in the United States in the 1940s, and I think they're following Oscar Ogg's work. And Salter did a couple of them in this style, not just the Crazy Horse, but there's a couple others. This sort of old style, Caslon-esque type, but done with all sorts of funky little shapes. And I think he got the idea for the background vignettes from actual Native American pictograms and drawings. You'll notice that a lot of these jackets, once we get to the mid-40s by Salter, are for Alfred Knopf. That was his principal client for jackets. And that's where he often intersects with W.A. Dwiggins. A lot of Dwiggins designed books actually had Salter jackets or later on Grushkin jackets. So there's some overlap among the people I've been researching with. This is a sort of I guess, an uncial, we might call it, by Salter. It's a much later design, as you can see, 1959. He's gotten away from the airbrush approach and started to use more panels and shapes of color behind parts of the cover text. One thing that Salter believed in was that the jackets should not show anything actually in the novel, but should suggest the content of the novel or the book. This is the same year as Crazy Horse, Apple in the Attic, also for Knopf. It's all about Pennsylvania Dutch. And that's what, so he's been influenced by Pennsylvania Dutch artifacts in this design in the background. So with that one and the next couple, I wanted to show some of his interpretation of pointed pen scripts. The Chapin sisters, also from the 1940s, for a publisher that I don't know much about, A.A. Wynn. Whoops, a bit fast there. Willie May from the late 50s. Interesting summary of the story. Negro servant from Georgia, telling her own story. And of course, this is just a few years after Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark civil rights decision in the United States. And this is Salter's own sort of handwriting, which he often uses in some of the small text on the jackets. The Garden of the Finzi Continis, it's in between a pointed pen and a broad pen style, and you'll find a lot of that with Salter's calligraphy that doesn't fit into neat categories. This is one of his favorite jackets. It's made into a famous movie, and it's sort of a modern Romeo and Juliet. So if you look carefully, you'll see the woman here, and then there's her her boyfriend, who has been blocked off by this wall. In the 60s, he did a lot of work for jackets by Shirley Hazard, and one that you'll find with Salter, and also Michael Harvey, that certain authors would either request that their jackets be done always by these artists, or the publishers would want to keep using them for more books by the same authors, so that there's sort of a series look. So with Shirley Hazard, Salter's jackets vary quite dramatically. Let's see one more in this talk. This one I think is suggesting a notebook. on the spine is what I think he's trying to show, the way the pages torn out of a notebook are. And when you get to the 60s, you'll see the Salter plays much more with just areas of color and patterns in his backgrounds. But I put it here because he's got, you know, sort of a pointed pen hint in his lettering, his main lettering. A Single Pebble is one of several he did for John Hersey. He did a Bell for Adana, which is in that sort of old style, funky lettering that's similar to the Crazy Horse. He did The Wall, which there's been some essays written about The Wall, the entire, just the jacket and the whole book. You go online. And he also did the book that was about the fallout from Hiroshima. That probably the most famous one that Hersey did, but now I've forgotten the title. This one I've always preferred of all the ones he did for Hersey. I just like the way he tried to suggest sort of an Asian cliff landscape with all these patterns. And the lettering, I'm not quite sure what we would call it. It's sort of a flat pen interpretation. You can see it's a more typical cursive style. So from examples of calligraphy that suggests pointed pen writing and moving into sort of classical, put that in quotation marks, Roman capitals by Salter. This is probably the closest we can find in any of his jackets, done quite late in his career, in 1962, the famous Climb of the West by Oswald Spengler, the abridged edition. And he made this sort of sketchy interpretation, I guess, to suggest the decline of the West, at least the decline of the Roman Empire. I actually did a cover inspired by this lettering for a Passover Haggadah years ago. This cover also has a typical Salter broad pen cursive, and we're going to see a lot of jackets with variations of the style you're seeing in the phrase of the abridged edition of, and also down below, Alfred Knopf, publisher, etc. Bang the Drum Slowly, which was made into a famous movie in the 1970s, I believe it is, has what looks like sort of a Salter's interpretation of Neuland. And there's another jacket he did the same year for an Arthur Clarke science fiction novel that also has a Neuland style lettering, which I'm not including here. I think this is a more interesting cover overall. And this is typical of Salter. They have these little vignettes, just be little images that suggest things in the novel without telling the actual story of the novel. So you sort of, ideally, you're going to get intrigued by, well, why is there a drum, you know, a telephone, a feather, a baseball bat, and some cards. I have not read the novel or seen the movie, but I believe it has to do with baseball. Report on Bruno, which is from the 60s, sort of a funky interpretation of Roman capitals, sort of a semi-serif, I guess we might call it based on later typographic terms. And I'm not sure what the background is supposed to be. If it's supposed to be sort of looking out at skyscrapers at night from an office building, it suggests to me, but I think here he's suggesting the holes of some sort of report, official bureaucratic report, somebody. The Judgment, which is one of the earliest Gore Vidal novels, has very typical Salter capitals, sans serif for the most part, maybe slight little triangular serifs in some places. You'll find this in a lot of his jackets, often for small text and not for the title as it is here. Here's an interesting version of that style that we did a couple of years next year, the time of the Gringo, with this split inline, colored inline. This is one of several he did where it's really important to see the entire jacket front and back. The Salter often would try to continue illustrations onto the back. This one's late 50s, 59, and I like the lettering for Taus. I'm not, I stuck it into this, category of capital, Roman capitals, so it clearly is not anything classical. And then you're seeing the ghosts of Native American warriors floating through this sort of background that I assume he must have made using pouring ink into water to get this effect. And Irvin Blacker has the lettering that's much closer to what we saw with the Gore Vidal jacket. Another one that's kind of hard to specifically classify that I've stuck here, I put it as capitals, the image of Chekhov from the 1960s, ball terminals. So maybe we could say there's a little bit of neoclassical letter forms, but Salter mixes things up. And the sketchiness is definitely tells me it's a 1960s jacket, as does using these sort of background panels that he started to switch to in the 50s away from airbrush. When you look at these jackets, although I've organized them often by the title lettering, there's a lot of other interesting styles of calligraphy and lettering going on in the smaller text, whether it's the author's name or a description of the book or just the publisher's information, or in this case, the translator. Going back to the 40s, we've got this one with a simpler form of calligraphic capitals by Salter. And I put this one in mainly not because I think it's my favorite, it's not my favorite when it comes to his calligraphy, but I love what he did with illustration. The publisher was Random House, and so he's taken their logo and turned it into part of the cover illustration and made the Random House logo into a scared house. And he's also, if you look carefully, the trees in the background are hands reaching out to the house. So he's kind of following in the footsteps of W.A. Dwiggins, who played with the Random House logo, in the Time Machine, the title page that he designed in 1931. And Phil Grushkin also does some variations on the Random House logo. Some of his jackets, they're not in a comic or playful way, just as a way of merging them with the rest of the design. Laura's a Man of War, that's one of the books that Dwiggins designed, but Salter did the jacket. The Knopf, here you can see, the change of the lettering from the front to the side. Fall of Paris, another good one for seeing Salter's airbrush work. The shadow of the Arc de Triomphe here. And Ilya Ehrenberg was a Russian, I believe, author. And my recollection is I read stories by him written when I was in a Russian literature class in college, but wasn't definitely this novel. But this, you see, some of Salter's way that he likes to make his lettering look very loose, and it was just dashed off. So there's a lot of cursive qualities in terms of ligatures or looping, and he's not always following standard sort of alphabet. So what looks like a broad pen thing here, but then you get an R and an S like that, which are much more pointed pen mixed in. The Waters of Kronos, he did a number of Conrad Richter jackets. Wiggins did almost all of Conrad Richter's books, though not this one, because by this point, Wiggins had passed away. This is one of the more amazing jackets, a suggestion of somebody drowning in water with this tree branch, looking like somebody's hand reaching out. Now I'm starting to move into the more distinctive, what people would call Salter-esque type of calligraphy, uh, sort of angular, italic in many cases. We can see it here in this little note about this book winning a prize. It's a little less obvious in the title and in the author's name, where he's changed the weight of the letters, avoided the thick, thin contrast. Is one of my favorites, especially the way in which he's used the colored panels and the suggestive torn paper. And there's your typical New England scene, salt box house and a stone wall. Home is the place, and here we've got a mix of his capitals and his angular italic. There's always these little loops he throws in with the little traces of the hand moving. Even there in the T, to the S and Stephanie, though they're not joined. This one, I always like the way the G and the T merge. And there's a little hint of some sort of notebook, reminiscence. Stencils here, little deliberate breaks in some of the letters. One of the earliest jackets of his that has this sort of distinctively Salter-esque cursive quality is this one from 1944. And you'll see a lot of hints, not simply of sort of an angular italic, but also of Batard in his shapes, in the way like the E and the D here and the S suggest Batard more than directly an Italian cursive. And what you're seeing, I think, in a lot of these early ones, and one of the inspirations for this stuff in Salter is the typeface legend, designed by F.H.E. Schneidler in Germany in 1937, I believe it is. Schneidler was somebody who I don't think Salter ever actually met in person, but they began to correspond with each other in the late 40s, early 50s. And there's actually a small publication of their correspondence. Salter really admired Schneidler's work, and he owned one of the few copies there are of Der Wassermann, which Schneidler and his students produced in 4 volumes. There's a copy at the Letterform Archive, I think, of Der Wassermann, and Columbia's got a copy, and Jerry Kelly, I believe, owns Phil Grushkin's copy. It's an amazing 4-volume work showing Schneidler's teaching in Stuttgart, with only one of the 4 volumes devoted to calligraphy. But in it, you'll see a lot of the tests that Schneidler did that led up to the legend typeface. And you might know the legend typeface because often it's used for Arab American, products like pita bread and stuff. And you can see some of that right here in the Pamela Hinkson, very close to the legend typeface. The splotches on this jacket are not part of Salter's design. It's a damaged jacket. I don't know what happened to it, but it's got some pieces of the cover have been torn off, unfortunately. But here you can see how angular Salter gets in this, Batard influence letterform. The Angry Strangers about drug addicts. A World of Love, the variations on this basic calligraphic approach. One of my favorites, this one from the 60s, the last year that he did any jackets. And this one, he's filled in the counters, gives you a very different effect. In the 50s, Modern Library. Book I had to read in college, The Mind of the South. With overlapping colors to get additional colors of those panels. Front and back, mother and son, with some very interesting variations like this Carolingian A, uncial E. So although this is a novel, a book of correspondence between a Japanese mother and her son, Salter is not making, pseudo-Japanese letter forms, but just a variation of his own letter forms that might suggest that. One of several books of Hermann Hesse's that he did covers for. This one I just like for the way that Z goes through and the double line of the capital N. The Affair, a very strange combination of the Salter-esque calligraphy and these decorative fat face letter forms. The second Shirley Hazard. And then I think one more slide after this. Nightmare of the Dark with a deliberately wobbly version of his Salter-esque italic. Oops, I'm sorry, one more. Nervous People, which was an amazing book, worth reading, hilarious stories. I think the edition I read did not have a lovely cover like this. They had a different cover. And now we're going to move to Phil Grushkin. I'm going to start out with Phil Grushkin of some examples of lettering that suggests type. This one with two journalists. This is a comp. And a number of the Grushkin items are comps or rejected or provisional designs, because the archive that I wrote the essay for included a lot of that material, which ended up at Columbia. And I think one from archive also has work in progress, which is very useful to see. So this is, I don't know what the final jacket looked like. It's not in the Columbia collection, only this comp. And you'll see a lot of spiraling designs that Phil Grushkin did. This is another comp, and it's very obvious. You can see at the top the white paint, and here's a line he's made to suggest where the spine will go. The final design of this one I have seen, it's not as nice. This one, the comp is falling apart. Something's missing right here. These are pieces, I believe, not ruby lith, it was electroset made, transparent plastic that you could cut up and use in your design. And I think that's what Grushkin used on this comp. The final design on this one is not as nice. Once again, this is a very interesting attempt to liven up a sans serif. This lettering is inspired by E.R. Weiss's Weiss capitals, the heavy version. I think it's called Weiss capitals #3. There's three different types of capitals. Very distinctive G. This is maybe might be my favorite of all of Grushkin's jackets for this Japanese novel. A little hint of the Albertus typeface by Bertold Volpi. A fabulous pattern in the background. Stencil letters for a novel by the Black detective novelist Chester Himes. And here you can see two of like 4 versions that Salter was playing with for this jacket. And then here on the right, you're seeing the final jacket design. So quite different ideas before he ended up with this. So the lettering seemed to have been, he figured it out pretty quickly what he wanted to do, a fat face style. So with this interesting S. On the left, you're seeing a comp, and then you're seeing a final design on the right. I actually prefer the one on the left. but I guess the publisher wanted, to have some explanation about the book and maybe didn't like the sun as the O, which I think is much stronger. And since it's about a hotel, let's show the hotel. Why not? Instead of whatever, all these little pictures. A comp, I have not, I can't remember if I've seen what the final was. Oh, yeah, I have, and it's totally, totally different. They look all like this. And I'm not even sure it's by Grushkin. There's an image online. It's too small for me to see if the signature is Grushkin's. But this comp I really like. I like the way he's mixed capitals and lowercase in this pointed pen style. And he likes to often show the overlap of strokes as you move quickly. You'll find a lot of that in Grushkin's lettering. This one's interesting. It's another sort of pointed pen influenced example, but he created this sense of fir trees in a forest by dribbling ink. Now, if we look carefully, it's not really trees, it sort of suggests trees. Chinese trumpets is one of, there's several comps that are in the collection, but he had this idea fairly early, a suggestion of notes hidden into the letter forms. This is a well-known history of jazz from the 1940s, at least jazz at that point. This is near the end of Grushkin's work as a jacket designer. Because in the early 60s, he becomes art director at Abrams. And some of the jackets towards the end of the 50s are much more sort of typographic in their lettering. This is the earliest one that I have from him, 1944. And there's that Oscar Ogg, sort of old style, loose, possibly brush influenced Roman letter forms. This one saw Grushkin crumpled up paper and then photographed it and then added color to create this sort of landscape in the background. About as close as we're going to get to classical letters with Grushkin, and even a sort of standard italic from him. Most of his italic is going to be influenced by George Salter as his teacher. But we'll see that his own work is different when you look at it carefully. It's not simply a copy of Salter's, but more in the spirit. There's a companion book to this of Shakespeare's comedies with a Grushkin jacket. And here's where we can start to see Grushkin's own calligraphy influenced by Salter and by the legend typeface, but not the same. And there's some airbrush going on here, and there's definitely airbrush in Grushkin's early work. Once again, Salter's influence. This is one of the most Salter-esque, I think, of all his covers. But here we'll start to see how he moves away. Sometimes he's often a bit stiffer than Salter, like this one about housing prejudice in the mid-50s. This one, which I really like with the cut paper, with the daisies at the bottom. A little bit looser in style. An Agatha Christie novel, and I think this was rejected. There's no spine on this, and what I could find online of this book does not show a jacket by Grushkin at all. But it could be a British edition versus an American edition. There are several comps for the big wheel. I just chose the one that looks like giant circles suggesting the big wheel. But the final design is the one on the right with all these stripes. And there's actually type for the sort of blurred, which I think Grushkin would have preferred to have done by hand. These are both comps. And you can see some of the ideas he's playing with and how different they are, both in terms of lettering and in terms of imagery and color. And like his mentor, Salter, he often have little hints of the movement of writing, like this, these ligatures. Comp on the left, final design on the right. Once again, preferring the comp, it's much more atmospheric. But I suppose the publisher wants to be more specific, or maybe more upbeat. Maybe felt it was too fiery. This is a lovely one. Apparently, it's not a great novel. Somebody online complained about its politics. I haven't read the novel, but apparently it has some comments on post-war British Labour Party. But Grushkin did a couple jackets of Angela Thurgo's books. I just like this pattern that he did. You'll notice we've seen a number of jackets of his with patterns in the background. Seem to be a favorite approach of Grushkin's. This one, despite looking stylistic like it's from the 50s, when I checked it out, it's probably 1973. So it's one of the few of his you can find done after 1960. But that's John Brown's face background. And for those who aren't American, John Brown was the abolitionist who tried to take over a federal armory and in the hopes of starting a race war before the Civil War began. So if you've ever heard of there was a song in honor of John Brown. Comp and final, Wayward Angel, which is quite interesting for this hidden figure in the background. But the final one has this woman entangled in circles. And the mechanical for this exists at Columbia. Marshwood, and you can really see Salter's influence in using little vignettes as well as a calligraphic style. In Grushkin's work, especially at this point in the late 40s. And this one, this is the same year as the previous one, same publisher, very different approach with the background. This one is also the same year. And from the 70s, this one suggests some of the work that he was doing in the 50s. A little stiffer, it's a very long title. And he's mixed it with Perpetua by Eric Gill, a typeface that Grushkin liked a lot and often modeled his capital R as, you can see the capital R here in honor with that curved leg. This one I just love the little tiny cars. Here's some examples of the way Grushkin interpreted Roman capitals in the Salter-esque spirit, but not identical. And you'll see some of his illustrations have different techniques than Salter did, playing with crayons and pastels and not just pen-drawn letter images. This is one of my favorites by Grushkin with the stripes and the way he used the pen to create the illustration to go with the lettering. And you'll see there's that curved art that was inspired by Perpetua by Eric Gill. All right. We'll see if we can get through Michael Harvey's work now. And these are the years I'm putting here, just the years of the work I'm showing you. It's not the years of all the jackets he did. Because as I said, there are some that go up to 1990. And I've broken up Michael's work into two parts, his early years, and it's sort of my subjective view of what his early years are, and then his mature style. Let's go back a moment. So for this, I've used Michael's Mez typeface that Adobe put out, and his Scorpio typeface, I believe it is, the other. So this is something which you would never think is Michael's work. It's not even signed. A lot of his early work is signed. But this looks like a typical sort of British book of the 50s. With this one, we can start to see hints of Michael's mature style in the love of shadowed letters in these initials. So there are some odd things like the lack of an ear on the G there. And it's also a very angular sort of italic or sloped Roman that he's done. And we get to see his more mature style, we'll see that he tends to like softer letter forms. This one's a very 50s looking jacket. I think Michael included it in his autobiography with a comment about it being, one of the styles of the 50s, having these sort of stumbled panels. But there are hints of Michael's later styles in this sans serif italic in the word mind and William. And we see a signature there, which a lot of his early jackets are signed, but later on they're not. I think I have a theory about why he quit signing. This one feels like it's very American. You saw one spiral designed by Grushkin, there's others, and I suspect Michael was looking at some American jackets. The lettering might be influenced by Hans Tisdall, a contemporary German-born British jacket designer whose work Michael admired so much that he made a typeface based on Tisdall's lettering, called Tisdall. And this shows some influence to me in the way the K and the E's and in these sharp points and the idea of outlining the letters. This one, I think, suggests that he was aware of Grushkin and Salter's work. The vignette is not their style, but it's a little vignette, and the Sunlit Years reminds me of some of their jackets. The Gordon Richdale is certainly much more typical of what I think Michael would have been influenced by in England. This one is definitely influenced by American jackets. Michael in his autobiography said that it was something very different for him. And I think he said he did it because other designers had failed at doing the jacket. He got called in. So he may have done it in a hurry. It also suggests some German jackets I've seen from the 50s in Atlantic Fury, in the sense of taking paint and sort of smushing it to get a sense of motion. This is a very 50s style jacket. It's one of the earliest when Michael's playing with zipatone patterns, which he does for 3 or 4 years on jackets. And then the bouncy lettering, you find that in American jackets of the day and possibly other British ones. But once again, Michael likes to put shadows on letters, and we'll see more and more of that as we move into his work. This is one that he had to redo for a client. He added these sort of panels, which I think were probably influenced possibly by George Salter's use of panels in the 50s jackets. So these are much more angular. Salters were often torn or kind of loosely shaped, more zoomorphic, biomorphic, I mean. And we can see some hints of Michael's more mature lettering in the Bruce Kenrick name. This one feels very 50s in the angularity. Michael's work usually is not very angular. This one's quite interesting. I love the way he suggested the shadow of the stranger, that change of color across the title in the middle of the book. But one of the things we're going to see is how Michael is really good at fitting titles onto a jacket cover. Making things really big or fitting a lot of words. And so look at the way he did this AR here, where the A is here. This one surprised me. It's an early work for Cambridge University Press of his, but I just like the way he played with figure ground, the way it changed right here, and getting the accent, how it relates to the angular serifs of this lettering. This is type. Some of his jackets that look like they have type are actually hand lettered, but this I'm pretty certain is actual. An actual sans serif type is as is. The name of the press down below. This early one there you can see his actual signature. And there's an early hint of one of his later typefaces, Zephyr, with the serifs moving on the left at the top and the right at the bottom. And here, once again, his interest in outlines and in shadow. Look carefully, this is thicker on this side than on that side of the lettering. So there's a little sense of dimensionality that he's playing with. Really quite a nice cover for this ink manual. stencil letters, and we'll see stencil letters as one of Michael's favorite ideas, both in private projects he did, but also in some jacket designs. Here's another example of playing with zipatone patterns. And an example of how Michael has squeezed a long letter into the space. And he becomes really a master of this, of how to do condensed letter forms. And a lot of variety. This one, my wife's got a copy of this in its original edition, which is red and blue. It's a bit scuffed up. So this is a second edition in green and blue. It's the same design, just a change of colors and the addition of second edition at the bottom. And now we're starting to get something that looks very typically Michael Harvey-esque. I won't say it's typical yet at this point, only because there's an illustration. When we get further in, we'll see that Michael basically relies entirely on just color and letter forms. This one's surprising for its roughness. I mean, this is not a comp. This is the actual design. And Michael got interested in doing stuff like this, I know, privately later in his life. But as a book jacket, it's kind of a rarity, especially given how early it is, 1961. Here we've got that idea of outline and shading. You see, you've got these letters are much more classical than what Michael begins to gravitate towards later on. Another example from the same period of the shaded letters, but also squeezing a long bit of text into space. Unusual for having a photograph. There are other jackets of his with photographs, especially at this time, the early 60s. And there are a few later on. I think those are things that the client insisted on. I think Michael would have preferred to have total control over the jacket and not have to work around a photograph. But I think this one is very successful in the way he's colored Sir Walter Raleigh. Another example of slightly sketchy or ragged letters from early in his career, but we're starting to get, once again, his shaded outline letters, his ability to squeeze things, though he's broken philosophy into two lines. Giraudot is another great example of squeezing letters, and it's worth comparing this to Hermann Zoff's Giraudot jackets from the early 60s, which are reproduced in several books and might be online, just to see how Zoff thought of Giraudot's plays in much more sort of classical style. There's a lot of C.S. Lewis jackets that Michael did in the 60s. This one is not C.S. Lewis, but a book about C.S. Lewis, and I put it in here because it shows a lot of text, all hand lettered by Michael, and he'll often do sloped Romans, not true italics, create a little bit of liveliness. This one is one that has some uncial influence, mainly in the E, but it's all you really need if you want to suggest something that's not straight Roman. And since this is the Eastern Orthodoxy and not the West, that's Michael's little hint besides this theme right there. Bodley Head was one of his major clients. He did books for their art director as well, and they published, I think, his first lettering book. This is sort of atypical in how sharp the lettering is of his. This one I would call, pure Harvey-esque. It's before the date I put as sort of a turning point, because I think there are examples earlier than 1968. This is 1965, but Glyndebourne, that long title, all squeezed in, but very soft letters. His own interpretation of capitals. It's not Trajan-esque. It's not Eric Gill. There's sort of more hints of later typographic forms in his capitals rather than calligraphic ones. We can say the same thing of St. John of the Cross. There is small type at the bottom. A lot of text. It's for Thomas Nelson, which is apparently they had a London office. They're a Tennessee publisher famous for their Bibles. And Michael often liked to open up the R's in his capitals. I think he was influenced a lot by Hermann Zoff's Optima. He was a big fan of Hermann Zoff's work. So I put 68 as an arbitrary date at which it seemed to me, in looking through the images I've got of his jackets, that he began to settle on very specific ways of making letter forms and designing jackets. So although I've shown you some that I'd say are very Harvey-esque, they're interspersed with things that aren't. A lot of them are done for Cambridge University Press. This one's very interesting in its decorative design, trying to suggest the vibrations. And I think that's Michael's lettering. I don't think that's a typeface, but I can't be sure. This one's fabulous. In doing this talk, I've discovered ones that I did not know at all. I love the way he sketched this one out. And if you've looked at Michael's books, you'll see he talks about drawing. It's very important that his lettering is drawing, and he shows you. He has pictures of his hands moving the pencil and how he sketches things. It's his approach to lettering, which is different from other people's approach. And he often, worked that into his designs later in his life. And I was surprised to see this early one that suggests that drawing approach of his. Here we've got a little bit of decoration in it, which I think makes a very beautiful cover. But later on, you won't see that much decoration in his work. It's just going to be lettering. But now we're starting to get very typical Michael Harvey letters. It's sort of soft. You almost, feel the letters being alive. So he would take, letters that are very compact and things that you would expect to be static and dull, and often makes them feel very warm and friendly. Sometimes it's just a simple thing like this little E here, or a U-shaped Y. Of course, here he's trying to suggest, a Middle Eastern flavor, just little hints of things. Now, here's an example of how he squeezed a lot into a jacket, and a nice interpretation of that volume 3, which was not in my mind when I did the title for this talk, but at least maybe it was subconsciously. Deliberately rough, another ton of text squeezed into a jacket. I'm really amazed. And if you really want to learn how to get a lot of stuff into space and not make it feel like you have a lot of stuff, look at Michael's jackets. They're really astonishing. This one I chose just for how he got autobiography on one line. This is very late. This is 1984 for Yale University, when he began to branch out from British clients to Dutch and American ones in the 80s. Early one that it's I think beautiful for his lettering, the soft motion. And you can see he's got often these upright italics. His italics are more upright. His Romans often lean. Those are little things that help to liven up his jackets. And his sense of color really starts to take over in the 70s and 80s. Now, this is unusual. This one, for how light his letter forms are. Most of the time, they're fairly heavy. This is the first one where I said, that is pure Michael Harvey. That's sort of why I chose the date 1968. The colors, the amount of text that's fitted in, the style of the letters. There's that R, this mix of serifs and sans serif forms. I'm amazed he got away with this one with the client, because the colors I think are beautiful, but you don't read it very quickly because they blend together so closely. And there's another, lots of text fitted in. And it's amazing that he doesn't, rely on ligature and stuff. Even the double T's he has in ligature. He often does this type of a leg on N's and H's, which I often, in this case, isn't really saving any space, but sometimes I think he does it to save space, rather than have the leg kick out into a exit stroke. Solzhenitsyn. There's a number of Bodley Head jackets, as well as Cambridge, as we're going along. Imagine squeezing Solzhenitsyn onto one line and still having it be heavy. That's part of his genius. There's another one, Resurrection, squeezed in. But he will touch letters sometimes. The legibility is always paramount with Michael. Someone's a little more typographic, a little lighter in letter forms. He'd like to have G's with the shape. He liked the ear of the G popping up. You'll see that in his typeface Ellington, and I think in Strahan, the companion to Ellington. And that is type at the bottom, kind of rare for Michael. He was really good at sans serif lettering, and obviously the influence of Optima is much more obvious here than in the serif or semi-serif versions. And he's very good at, playing with negative space and doing asymmetric layouts of the text. Sometimes he would give in to hyphenating words rather than squeezing them in. This makes sense given the content of this book. This is from the same year. I don't know who this publisher is, VAW. It's too bad the logo's there. It kind of ruins the cover. He began doing work, as I said, for Dutch and American publishers in the 80s. This is for a Dutch publisher. I put this one in here with the sans serif. It's not quite a sans serif like the last two in this part. But with hand lettering, you can do all these variations, and Michael was really good at subtle variations on some basic letter forms. This one, I think, is 69. There's a lot of editions of this book, and I don't know which ones for sure are the ones that this one, but I'm basing it on the fact that there's type on the bottom here. But I chose it for this lettering, which is similar to the typeface I used for the title of this talk, this Braff typeface. It's one of the earliest examples of this shadowing that's a sans serif. Here we can see one of the longer titles in this style a couple years later for Cambridge. Another one for Cambridge. He gave in to hyphenating declamation. I think he could have squeezed it in, but he probably didn't. With only two words in the title, it would have been too small on the page. This exists in a different color combination. I don't know if it's a different edition or the publisher had multiple versions or a later edition. But this is the first one I ever saw of the two, and one that Michael reproduced in his autobiography. And it's an interesting outline letter form, but you didn't do that many of. You usually had shading. This one doesn't have any deliberate shading in it. Examples of his interest in stencils. You see it here. 1974. I know he was interested in making stenciled personal works in the 90s. He did some for some exhibitions we did together. Look at how he did the T, by the way. This one he turned into a typeface, which he named Balthazar after this book jacket. He did a number of jackets for this theologian, all in the same style for this publisher, which is SPCK, Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. The same people that William Casdon worked for. But look at that AS. That's a typical calligrapher's solution that Michael's picked up. Here's his hooked N's and H's and his ears on G's that pop up. This isn't, for the last couple that I've got for Michael are where he's kind of broken away from what we expect, the sort of, sort of quiet style. And this is an early example of the style that's a little funkier for this George Eliot book from Bodley Head with these sort of drippy letters. And then we've got one of several he did for a collection of P.G. Wodehouse books in the late 70s, for Barry and Jenkins, all with similar lettering, especially the colors. It was the one for G's. Yeah, I've seen a couple others. I like the Mr. Mulliner ones. I like the way he put the period, like the R is kicking it as a ball. And I suspect that these heavy letters were influenced by Hermann Zoff's Sistina typeface. That E is, it's very much like Sistina to me. Amazing to find some examples of Michael curving letters. He usually squeezes things in on the horizontal, but there are 2 or 3 in the collection. This is my favorite of them all, especially the way he put the introduction of Anthony Burgess in. So you've got sort of, reflecting the title uh, by this, I believe, Indian-born author, Dasani. And then I think this is the last one after Hitchcock. There's actually a couple Hitchcock jackets Michael did. But here, if you want to end your sentence with a preposition, we've got it in the title, Stories to Stay Awake By. And then this acid green lettering. And the last jacket is an angular one. I said most of Michael's work in his mature years is much softer, but for surviving trauma, angularity makes perfect sense. This is for Yale, 1989. And I'm not sure if this is a jacket that inspired his Mez typeface, but it's very similar to letters in the Mez typeface, which is what I use for the title of the first section of Michael's work. So they're all unfortunately deceased. Michael died a little over a decade ago, Salter before I was still in high school, and Grushkin in the late 90s. This is Michael's Braff typeface and his Ruskin typeface. And then I want to thank Rachel Stewart, one of Michael's daughters, who gave me a lot of the images. Paul Grushkin, who gave me a lot of images before he passed away. Newberry Library, where the Salter archives are. Columbia, where some of the Grushkin archives are. And Reading, where a lot of Michael's archives are.
Beautiful examples of book jackets. Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
So I take questions if people have them.
Yeah, well, not question, just an observation, which is what I usually come up with. The delight has gone out of book jackets since these gentlemen stopped working, and the most book jackets now are so blingy and samey that you don't get these wonderful distinctive styles. And it's maybe because I'm biased because I'm interested in lettering, but
Well, I think there might still be distinctive styles out there, Margaret, but
yeah, but they're rare.
Go back to the 80s in the United States, you started getting jackets that were going away from hand lettering and from calligraphy. I mean, that started to some extent in the United States in the 70s, but there were still people who did a lot of hand lettering in those years. And then you got the Chip kids in the 80s and the 90s who were more conceptual. And there were all these sort of, little hints about the book, sort of following up more on Alvin Lustig's work of the 50s. And I don't really know what's been going on in the last, in the 21st century in jackets as much as I used to know in the 80s and 90s. But I think that, type has taken over from hand lettering.
And the use of photographs rather than drawn illustration mostly, or unless it's the Mills and Boon kind of romantic.
Yeah. Well, also
depends
which country you're talking about and which publisher, genre of book, because even in the days of Michael Harvey and Salter and Grushkin, there were books that were totally different. I mean, we could do a talk on the heyday of calligraphy and lettering in jackets, because there was a heyday, especially in the United States, 40s and 50s. Salter and Grushkin were just two of, easily 20, just in the United States alone. And Michael, I mean, there were others, I'm sure, in England. I know I've seen John Woodcock jackets.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah,
I'm being very general. I know that.
Well, I think you're true about, I think you're right about, that today we're not seeing things like that. Because it's, people, they gravitate towards type. I mean, the designers don't have the skills, even if the publishers would be willing.
Well, yeah, I think that's where the problem lies, really.
Stephen Raw was I don't know, I invited Stephen, but he's not here. I haven't talked to him in years. But Stephen Raw was a prolific jacket
Oh,
designer,
yes, that's true.
started through Michael. Michael was like his mentor. And Stephen took off doing jackets through the 90s and early 2000s in England mainly. A few showed up in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, he lives in my old stamping ground in Manchester.
Yeah, I haven't talked to him or seen him in ages. I hope he's
Mm.
good health.
I think so. He's still working. He does a lot of work for Manchester Cathedral. There's some of his lettering that decorates the organ pipe casings there, which I noticed a couple of years ago. So
Anyone else?
thank you. It was wonderful. I really enjoyed that.
Margaret, thanks.
Of the three designers, I thought that Harvey was the most, his book jackets had the most polished look. Although I loved the very expressive and calligraphic look of the other two designers, Salter and Grushkin. Um, although his work did look very, very polished and almost typographical. I loved his book jacket for Persistence in Religion by Greeley. It had a very David Jones look, and I don't know if you can rank.
That it might have been influenced by David Jones. He would have been very aware of Jones's work, either through Nicolette Gray's book about Jones or articles, or maybe even through, being part of the overall Eric Gill tradition, which Jones was in. Um, when I suggested to Raoul doing a talk, I suggested, these three people, each of them to be individual, and Raoul said he preferred Michael Harvey, and I was disappointed. I decided to do all three, which made this really hard to compress into a short talk. And it seemed kind of odd to me to be putting Michael with Grushkin and Salter. Salter and Grushkin I've done together because they're related both, personally and professionally and stylistically. And Michael is like totally across the ocean. But on the other hand, I thought it was a nice contrast to see, a British approach and somebody who draws letters and carves letters from somebody who writes letters, even though both Salter and Grushkin could draw. And Michael, had beautiful handwriting, but he never considered himself a calligrapher, despite doing a book about calligraphy. Look carefully, you can see that you can tell that he's not a natural calligrapher in that sense. But Raoul's right. Michael's work looks more polished. I mean, Grushkin and Salter went for a much more spontaneous, fresh, approach. They even threw in, as I said, little ticks, little elements to their letter forms, joins and overlap strokes and things that would suggest that this was not polished lettering. They didn't want that. While Michael, became more and more typographic, and I think that's an accurate, way of describing his letters. I mean, they're not type. He's not imitating a typeface, but it's not surprising that he turned his lettering into typefaces. And it might be the conservativeness of British publishers, maybe Michael's own, even though Michael was quite a gregarious, humorous person. And not as severe as you might think from looking at his jackets. But it also may be as I said, the publishers and the content. I was surprised at how many jackets he did for religious topics. When I was going through the images I've got, I mean, it might be half of the 600 that I think I have. And of course, some of them were obviously for religious publishers like SPCK, but others for Cambridge and stuff were just religious titles. And maybe that made him, think you can't be playing around.
Paul, I want to thank you for this presentation. It's very informative for me, and I particularly liked that your attention to very small personal details of any given jacket. I had the privilege of studying with Salter in 64, 65 at Cooper. And also with Paul Rand
No,
earlier.
Paul Standard.
No, Paul Rand was there briefly. And also with Ismar David.
Ismar David, yes. Would have been,
Yeah. But Salter was the most inspiring of all of these as a teacher. One time he played from LP records. He spent a classroom time playing a recording of the Goldberg variations. And then we spent a couple of weeks trying to design a record cover for that, which of course none of us was mature enough to do. I just also wanted to mention, I really appreciate seeing Ellington and Dolphy among your LPs. And those are the only ones I could read. And I wanted to mention, Raul, that's a lovely shirt. I've had a very enjoyable morning.
I'll say, Robert, that one thing that Michael and I were friends over was jazz. Our tastes, weren't always exact. I mean, I don't think he appreciated Ornette Coleman or Dolphy, but he and I liked Ellington. He got me to discover the Buck Clayton jam sessions, which we used to listen to while driving from Dorset to London at full blast. One of my favorite experiences. And Michael, when I would visit him, we would sit, either in his studio or whatever, drinking scotch and listening to Ruby Braff or Lester.
Yeah, when I was in New York, I got to hear Coltrane and Ornette and Eric Dolphy, heard Dolphy. I lived near the 5 spot, and of course it was across the street from Cooper. So in the afternoon, it wasn't a jazz house. It was just a kind of a local semi-beat generation drinking spot.
Yeah, there's a famous Dolphy concert, as they call it, from the 5 spot. Concert. It's recorded in a nightclub.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot, that like I just lucked out. And I can't attribute it to anything else.
Well, thank you.
It was a great environment.
I really want to thank you for presenting all of this. I had been known to buy a book because I liked the cover, no interest in the book. Of course, now we carry around phones that we can take pictures of them, but at the time, no. And I want to thank Raul for speaking up for Michael Harvey. I really enjoyed seeing all of his. And it's very instructive to see him do such long words in such a small space. So that alone, so I'm thankful there's going to be a recording. I can go back and really look at these things and make note. And yes, all of your comments and everything, Paul, so great. And references to what typeface it may have been based on, etc. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Paul.
I agree with that.
Be sure to check out Paul's website, paulshawletterdesign.com. It has a lot of interesting articles in it, and you can also see some of the books that he's published there. The next Blackletter Brunch will be on Sunday, April 28th, in which Carl Rohrs will talk about The Poster, its journey from Vienna Secession to San Francisco Psychedelic and beyond. Until then, keep on lettering. Thank you.
Thanks, Raul.
Thank you, Raul.
Bye.
So thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.